one more guest to go here on this Thursday meeting show. That is Mr. Rolf Michaels from WagerTalk.com. Rolf, how's it going today, man?
Good. You know what? Brad Powers told us the truth. Father Time never loses. So that's the first time I've ever heard him use that. So
maybe he's I don't know. Maybe he's getting wiser as he gets older.
He's giving us ancient secrets now and melding them into handicapping.
All right, perfect. Hey, you know what? I mean, he's not wrong. So we'll see. What does happen with Tom Brady here as he goes throughout the rest of the season, but. We got a lot of games to get to here on both the college football and the NFL side, and as you heard there, I'm going to go ahead and add one more to you with the Packers and Vikings as we get deeper into the show. But let's start on the college football side as we usually do here. And, Rolf, I know that you're a big fan of situational handicapping, and you and I like to talk about a lot of those different angles here on the show. So let's go ahead and start with some of that, beginning with the game between Akron and Western Michigan. Game 121-122 out there on the board. Western Michigan's a 14-point favorite in one of the most unique spots we've seen in a long time, coming off of that marathon game last week against the Buffalo Bulls.
There's times when you're going to have situations that just haven't occurred, or maybe it's occurred once. I think that tied for 7 overtimes. But quite simply, it's a situation that I'm either going to play against or I'm not going to play on the team. And this is a situation that people don't realize. 7 overtimes may only be, 35 minutes, an extra 3 quarters of games, but there's so much emotion spent in those 7 overtimes that it's really like playing a doubleheader that day, or perhaps even more than that. You have the ebb and flows of everyone scoring a touchdown and having to tie them, and then you go first and they tie you. So we're going to talk about both of those games, both sides of those plays, and clearly, you don't always know what's going to happen, but don't put yourself in a bad situation where after the fact you said, why did I play that when that team had just done that the week prior? And this is one of those situations. I'll either look to play on the opponent or pass. In this case, Akron hasn't played great. They're a team I would want to play against, in fact. They were off a misleading win against Ball State. You look at that score, and it was 31-3, but they got outgained. They were plus 3 turnovers. They were fortunate in field position. And their Ohio State transfer, their running back Warren Ball, who has 330-some yards the first 5 games, was injured and out for the year. So this is a game where I'm going to look to play at Akron or pass, and because of the Akron situation, it's a game I'm just going to pass on.
I think, we need to take a little bit of a deeper look here into this Western Michigan-Buffalo game. Yeah, it went 7 overtimes, and there was a lot of emotion. And, another thing here about this game is that, for Western Michigan, I mean, they're kind of accustomed to being in the limelight, being in the spotlight with what P.J. Fleck did in that program. So maybe the extra media coverage here this week isn't really a big deal for them. We'll talk about that a little bit more on the Buffalo side here in a minute. But this is a game that Western Michigan led by 10 going into the fourth quarter. Buffalo needed a last-minute field goal drive to tie the game and send it to overtime. So for Western Michigan, I mean, this is a game where, from a win probability standpoint, for a while, they were up there. They were 93% to win when they had a 10-point lead, there in the third quarter. And all of a sudden, things kind of got away from them a little bit. You got a first-year head coach in Tim Lesser. I think you also have to look at this Western Michigan side and say, okay, they feel like they survived, and kudos to them for that. But, I mean, they were the better team through 3 quarters of this game and still had to play 7 extra periods. So that may be something that can have a carryover.
Well, and you have to look at what they've done previously. They were a 20-point favorite to Idaho, game number 3. They were outgained in that game. They were a 14-point favorite to Ball State. You may not think of it, but they only had a 150-yard edge. They were plus 2 turnovers. So both of those games going in, and again, by the way, the Buffalo game, they were outgained by 38 yards as a 7.5-point favorite. So they've been outgained in 4 of their 6 games this year, and the only opponents they won were Ball State and Wagner. So again, it's a different team. The defense isn't quite the same. You have a new head coach coming in this situation. You're off that road game. Again, it's a team that I would certainly look to play against. And one thing I'd like to mention is I think this will have a 2-week carryover. I think even if they get by this game, if they don't win, even if they win and cover this game, I think you can look to fade both teams again next week, because that's when the attrition really starts to ramp up after they play another game this week.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I'm glad you brought that point up, too, because Western Michigan plays Eastern Michigan. You've got a little bit of a directional rivalry here between those three schools, with, of course, Central Michigan also included. So that's a really tough game for them next week. I mean, in a sense, you could kind of look at this as a bit of a sandwich spot for them because, Akron really hasn't been a factor for quite some time there in the MAC East, but Eastern Michigan, that is a rivalry game for them. So, there could be a bit of a look-ahead situation for Western Michigan here this week. Now, of course, the other team that we've talked about being part of that 7-overtime marathon is the Buffalo Bulls. No Tyree Jackson again this week, but Northern Illinois getting steamed here on the road in Western New York, up from a 3.5-point favorite to as high as 6 out there at Heritage, most books at 5. This is a pretty notable line move here.
Well, all Northern Illinois done is lose to Boston College by 3, beat Nebraska, go out and have a 161-yard edge at San Diego State covering that. The only reason they don't win that road game is they were -4 turnovers. They have an easy game last week, holding Kent State to 3 points and 131 yards. You're not under much pressure on offense or defense if you can hold your foe to 131 yards in that game. They are playing now on the road for the third time in 4 games. And they have some quarterback issues too. They were talking about Santa Catarina was a starter who didn't start every game. He was a part-time starter earlier. Marcus Childers came in. They're looking at giving him some time. But let me tell you what, if you're going to tune into this game, Northern Illinois' defense is completely legit. They're allowing 261 yards on the year. They have a player, Sutton Smith, on the D-line. He has 7 sacks, 14.5 TFLs. He will be in the NFL next year, and they're just an incredible team. And on the flip side, Tyree Jackson was a player I loved early on in the year. They went into Minnesota, and they lost by 7. He had a good game against Army. But, hey, Drew Anderson came in the Florida Atlantic game 3 games ago. They got outgained against Kent State last week, gaining 377 yards. His first start was on the road. And I'll tell you what, it's not too bad when you make your first start in front of the home fans and you throw for 597 yards and put up 683 yards in all for Buffalo. So this is a situation where Buffalo's O-line has only allowed 1 sack in the last 2 games, and they're number 5 in the country in O-line sacks allowed against a great D-line of Northern Illinois. It's a great matchup if you are going to watch that game.
So do you have any kind of lean on this one? Obviously a little bit of the line value has gone away with a key number of 4 being taken out of the equation here. Anything that you like with this game in that dead zone of 5.5?
Well, again, I'm going to play against Buffalo, if anything. This is a situation where, if I had to pick a side, and again, I hate to be very vague with our customers, but there's just times you don't like games. I would have to bet Northern Illinois, no question. They're 4-1 ATS on the year. Their only cover of the year was last week when they allowed 131 yards because they only scored 24 points and they were laying 23 to Kent State. So, again, anytime you have that type of team playing defense travels on the road much better than offense. And, again, against a quarterback whose only 2 defenses he's seen was Kent State and Western Michigan, it's a situation where I think Northern's defense wins this battle. I think it'll be a lower-scoring game. We're getting some value in the total as well because of last week's high-scoring game. Lean with the road team, like the under a little bit more in this one.
Well, and of course, as you said, you think this is kind of a 2-week look in terms of the situational spot. Buffalo makes the long trip down to Oxford to play Miami of Ohio on October 21st, and Miami of Ohio with some quarterback concerns right now. We'll see if they're able to solve them here this weekend with Gus Ragland being out, but that's a spot where you could really circle that one and look to go against Buffalo with what is a fairly long and kind of difficult trip. Oxford's sort of way down there in Ohio. No real easy way for Buffalo to get there. So that could be one of those spots where you do look to make a situational play against the Bulls. All right, I want to touch on this Rutgers and Illinois game here. This game 135, 136 on the board, because we're seeing Rutgers money come in on the road in a Big Ten game And that's something that should sound alarm bells in your mind.
Well, it sure should, because Rutgers is 1-4 straight up on the year. Their only win was to Morgan, and when they beat Morgan State 65-0, that skews all of their offensive and defensive numbers. You know, early on they covered against Washington, and then they lost outright to Eastern Michigan. So the only opponent they've played that was a single-digit line all year was a 5.5-point home favorite to an Eastern Michigan team that rarely wins road games, yet they lost that game. This is one of those situations where, you know, I've said it in the past, you have to learn to win on the road straight up before you learn to cover on the road. And that's the problem when you're talking about Rutgers, is they are not a good road team. They 0-5 in Chris Ash's first year, and then 2-5 in the last year of the previous coaching regime. So, you know, they have lost 7 straight road games since he's been there. And to me, if you're going to get a single-digit line like this situation, it clearly is the home team for me.
Well, I find that interesting. I mean, you look at last week's game between Illinois and Iowa, and you want to talk about misleading box scores. Iowa won this game 45-16. Illinois had 446 yards of offense to Iowa's 441. Iowa had 21 fourth-quarter points in this game to really put this thing away. They were big benefactor of turnovers, of course. Illinois had 4 of those. Illinois has turned the ball over a ton this year. Their quarterbacks have a 2-9 touchdown-to-interception ratio. So that's what I'm kind of curious to get your take on about this game, Rolf, is this line movement a fate? This line movement has to be a fate of Illinois, right? I mean, that's really the only explanation for it.
Well, you know, people saw the Nebraska game Friday night two weeks ago when they only put up 199 yards and they got beat 28-6. You put that on top of an Iowa so-called beatdown, as people say, you know, losing by 29 again. But you're right, you know, I'm going to look in the same situation. When there's 2 bad teams playing, I want to look how those teams did in those situations. We already talked about Rutgers losing at home as a 5.5-point favorite. Well, Illinois beat Ball State as a 5.5-point favorite. They beat Western Kentucky as a 5.5-point dog, and they lost the Nebraska game. But Nebraska is not the same level as Western Kentucky, Ball State, and Rutgers. Even though they've been playing poorly, they still have more talent than those other 3 teams. So clearly, this is a situation for me. I look back at, you know, Illinois has not been a home favorite often, but, you know, they are 3-3 the last 3 years. So they've been put in that situation. They know how to handle the situation. They've won games straight up in that situation. And now they're going, you know, they made the quarterback change last week, and they probably go with Jeff George again in this game. You know, and Jeff George, he had a decent game. You know, he's got he had a lot of turnovers in that game. He turned the ball over 3 times and only threw for 51%. But that's the problem with Illinois right now. I mean, they have a team ratio of 2.9, which is the worst in all of college football. So when you're playing from behind, those quarterbacks are forced to make plays that you don't want to see them make, and they're throwing interceptions. The key to Illinois in this would be a game where I might look to wait and play it live. If they get the early lead and the quarterbacks aren't forced to throw from behind, I think they're a team at home that can blow out this Rutgers team. If they're a team that Rutgers, let's say, you know, Janorian Grant is Rutgers' best player by far. He's a return man. He's a wide receiver. He missed a couple games, including that Ohio State shutout loss. If Janorian Grant runs back a kickoff or a punt early and then Illinois is playing from behind, I might not play the game. So this may be one of those live situations that if Illinois has that early lead, I would go ahead and pound them and feel comfortable in that role with Rutgers not being able to come back.
One injury note to keep an eye on for this game, Illinois running back Mike Epstein. He's a freshman. He's rushed for 346 yards this year. Really been the only shining spot on this offense with 6.1 yards per carry. He is questionable this week. Didn't practice on Tuesday. I haven't seen an update as of yet. I don't know if you have, Rolf, but if he's unable to go, that will certainly change the dynamic for Illinois quite a bit. If he is able to go, you know, and they do have the opportunity to nurse a lead here and kind of put this game away, that kind of speaks more to Rolf's point there about looking to possibly play Illinois in that type of situation. All right, we'll slide on down the board here quite a ways, and let's talk about this Oregon State game. They take on Colorado here this week, and obviously a lot going on with the Oregon State program. This game 175-176 on the board. Gary Anderson walks away from the program, comes to light that apparently had some pretty disparaging remarks about his assistant coaches, walks away from a pretty significant payday, says it's about the program, says it's about the kids, says it's about him not being able to help them a whole lot. Now all of a sudden we're seeing a little bit of Oregon State steam here in this game. Number open 12.5. It's down as low as 10, but the consensus number 10.5 out there.
Well, a couple points in this game is perhaps we're seeing some Oregon State money because last week UTEP was in the same situation. They had a coaching change. Now again, they were a little different because they bought who was their head coach for numerous years, took them to their last bowl appearance, and Mike Price was out of football for 4 years, came in, the kids had heard about him, the kids were excited to play for him, and then UTEP has a great performance against Western Kentucky. So perhaps they think this is the same situation, but it's not. I mean, Oregon State's interim is their DB coach Hall. Hall's only in his second season. He was only a DB coach at Weber State the year prior. He's only been a position coach for 3 years. He was a GA and just a very, very low assistant prior to that. So putting the game calling situations on him, I have a real issue. You know, you look at OSU, their quarterback Luton is out. I mean, Garrettson started for him. Daryl Garrettson started for him 6 games last year. Threw for 50%, had a 3-4 ratio. You may remember him from a few years back. He made 11 starts at Utah State. So while they have an experienced quarterback, Nall is questionable for them, their running back, and he is their team. I mean, he has rushed for 100 yards 8 times, which isn't easy to do when you have that bad of a team. So I am not understanding this Oregon State money move at all. But with that being said, you have Colorado, who's now traveling, and there's very few times that one situation or one angle will keep me off of a game. But Colorado has only won as an away favorite over 7 once in the last 8 years. And, again, you got to go on the road. They're not the same team on the road. Their defense is giving up a lot of yards. So, again, unfortunately, this is a situation where I don't have either side on this game.
I think what's really difficult, I think there are a few really difficult things about this game. Obviously, figuring out how Oregon State's going to respond to Anderson leaving and then respond to such a young and inexperienced interim head coach is, a pretty significant angle of this game. But also, I mean, look, Oregon State the last 3 weeks, they played Washington State, Washington, and Southern Cal. 2 of those games on the road. Those are 3 legit top 20, top 15 types of teams. So how much can you really put into those games for Oregon State as it pertains to a game against Colorado, who's a little bit closer to their level? Now, on the Colorado side, played well in that opener against Colorado State, beat up on Texas State. A lot of people do that. Beat up on Northern Colorado. That's something that an FBS team should do in that situation. But their last 3 games, Washington, blown out. UCLA, right in that game. Arizona, right in that game, but couldn't find a way to win either one of those. And it kind of makes you wonder, we talked about Colorado and all they lost defensively, including DC Jim Leavitt. Offensively, they still seem to be okay. It's tough because they should be able to score on anybody. This is a spot where the defense can get right against an Oregon State offense that's not very good. But still, you just don't feel confident with Colorado laying a big number, as you alluded to.
Well, the difference in those games, though, Arizona, they gave up those 350 yards to the quarterback rushing, who was a backup quarterback who came in that Arizona game. But you look at the UCLA game that they lost on the road, they were in that game. It was 27-23. They were only outgained by 25 yards. And even going back 1 week further against Washington, while they lost that game 37-10, they actually were only outgained by 108 yards. That's not bad for being a double-digit home dog. The opposite end, though, Oregon State, while they've gotten blown out in their last 4 games, let's say that, because it includes Minnesota, they've been outgained by 195, 323, 137, and 186. I'm looking at the first quarter scoring now for them in the last 4 games. They've trailed 10-0, 7-2, 7-0, 14-0. So their only first quarter score in those last 4 weeks is a safe. When you're playing from behind, that is just a trying and tough thing to do when your offense is inept anyway. So, Oregon State's clearly going to need some breaks. I think they're probably going to need to be, +2 or +3 on turnovers to be able to be competitive in this game, especially, with the new quarterback and if Nall doesn't go.
Well, that may be a little bit of a wagering angle then to look at how much this Oregon State offense has struggled in the first quarter of games. Maybe you look to play a first quarter under or a first half under with that or in that game, and then if you want some action on that one. And of course, too, then you kind of cover the uncertainty factor of, we don't know what this new head coach is going to do, how this team is going to respond. Right now, the first half total sitting 28.5. So, you may be able to find a little bit of value there if you look to play the first half total in this game. All right, let's flip over to the NFL side here, talk a little bit of professional football. We'll begin on Sunday. Game 251, 252 on the board. Cleveland takes on Houston. Houston, either 9.5 or 10, pretty much across the market, 11 at 5 dimes with some teaser protection there in that game. Were you surprised to see Houston, who lost their 2 best defensive players last week to season-ending injuries, open this big of a favorite against Cleveland, or not really?
Well, again, you're looking at the Browns. They're 1-20 their last 21 games straight up. You're looking at last week's scores. And again, the difference is Cleveland moved the ball with Hogan after he replaced Kaiser. Kaiser already with 9 interceptions. So, under Hogan, they're getting a little new life. They're not turning the ball over. They're driving. Interesting that the Browns, down 3 last week, passed up a field goal to tie the game and go for it. That seemed to change the entire situation. So, it seems as if, though, Cleveland doesn't even want to be competitive. But, you're home for a 3rd straight game for the Browns. But the situation I will play on here and is playing off Houston as a loss. O'Brien is 7-1. O'Brien is 7-1 as a home favorite off a loss. And, if I could jump back and just mention something, you guys were talking about the Patriots in the early, and this was that same type of situation. You guys talked about the Patriots and their bad defense, and if you can bet on them and if you can't. Well, let me just say this, that they're 0-3 ATS when they're not off a loss, and they're 2-0 ATS off a loss. Brady and Belichick are now 19-3 against the spread off a straight-up loss. You give the team with that talent the motivation off a loss, that gives them reason to play better, and that's exactly been the Patriots this year. And I think that's the situation with Houston. It was a disappointing game with KC. Watt is out now. And Deshaun Watson, I'm sure Deshaun Watson doesn't have a chip on his shoulder from being passed over by Cleveland because what would be the other side, being the quarterback of the Browns. So he's probably very thankful the Browns didn't take him, but perhaps this is a situation where he doesn't mind showing that Cleveland, coaching staff and those in charge of drafting how good of a quarterback he was. So if he's got a chance to get an extra score or two, perhaps he does. But O'Brien off a loss in this situation. It's also a game that I'm gonna use the over. I do like the over in this game. Hogan, moved the team for 441 yards. Being a first road start is tough, especially going to Houston and do it. But with Houston's defense and their D-line and their pass rush, not quite decimated, but certainly down a few notches, I expect the Browns to score some points, and I think Houston will score plenty.
I think Houston scores in this game as well. One of the things I cannot figure out for the life of me about the Browns is how Greg Williams continues to line his safeties up 20 yards off the ball. And, this is a team that's been carved up in the middle. They've been carved up on out routes when corners aren't able to help out. They're carved up. Someone comes across the middle, corner jumps, safety can't get over there. And a lot of those things are kind of hallmarks of Bill O'Brien's offense because he comes from that Bill Belichick coaching tree. So I think everything that Houston does schematically here is a really good fit for them against the Browns to move the football. They've got 2 very good wide receivers in Hopkins and Fuller. You got a good, versatile slot type guy in Bruce Ellington. You can use Lamar Miller out of the backfield. He can catch a little bit. They've got a couple tight ends that can play. there's a lot of weapons here for this offense. Deshaun Watson's been set up to succeed here with the skill position talent around him. And if you ask the Browns to go out there, I mean, if you're like the over in this game. If you ask the Browns to get into the 20s to try and match Houston in the 30s, it's a struggle. Even Kevin Hogan or not, it's a struggle for them. So I think that this is, a spot where if you are interested in laying some chalk here this week, and if you like the card, you're going to have to, maybe Houston is one of those teams that can go out there and kind of name the score.
This is a situation too, just to bring up to our listeners, where stats could be very misleading. You look at the Browns right now, and their defense is number 5 in the NFL in yards per game allowed, and it's just a situation where you're playing at a slow pace. You're not pressured because you're not playing from behind if you're the Browns' opponents. You're getting a big lead, and all you have to do is run the ball. So I think Cleveland, again, that's one of the times where you can look at stats, and you have to look at them with caution and sometimes throw them out. And I think the Browns' defense is not the 5th best defense in the league. I wouldn't even rank it in the upper half. So I think you have a misleading number in this game, and be cautious as you're looking at stats and realizing why that number is as it is.
All right, let's slide down to game 259, 260 here between Green Bay and Minnesota, and I wanted to slide this one down to you because I wound up talking about a couple of extra college games with Brad than I had expected to. The Packers laying 3 in this spot here. Looks like we'll probably wind up with Case Keenum for Minnesota. I don't know. I mean, the way Sam Bradford was moving around last week, it looked like he was just put in a very compromising situation. Like he was a guy that just couldn't move the ball. So, in looking at this game here, I mean, you got a Green Bay team off of a road win against Dallas, come from behind win there for them in that one. Minnesota, feisty game. They hung on to beat the Bears. Jerick McKinnon looked really good placing Dalvin Cook as the focal point of the backfield here. There's a lot going on with this game, not to mention it's a division rivalry with a division home dog.
Well, you have a division home dog, but in this case, I'm gonna back the team with the quarterback. There's no question. Minnesota does have a solid defense. They're number 1 in third down conversions. They're number 1 in goal-to-goal D. But I think a lot of that is, because they faced Chicago, Tampa Bay, Pittsburgh when they were struggling. It's a game where Minnesota's off the Monday night game, but that's negated with Green Bay being having to travel to Dallas and now playing a second of back-to-back. I think Green Bay has the superior talent still. I think if you have Aaron Rodgers in a division game, I'm going to back him. I think certainly I agree with you that Case Keenum has to be the quarterback because we saw his mobility running for a first down and just being able to move in the pocket where Bradford looked as if though he, with his knee, he couldn't even move the ball. I think you also see a little more Minnesota now was their first game without Dalvin Cook. I don't think that rush game does the same thing against Green Bay's defense. This is one where I'm going to back the Packers. You're off a Chicago win, 35-14. You put up 35 points at Dallas again. You've improved for 4 straight weeks. They opened up with 17 against Seattle, 23 against Atlanta, 27 Cincinnati, 35 the last 2 weeks. So you have an offense that's finally under gear. You have Rodgers now connecting with his wide receivers, which he struggled those first couple games. And I'm going to be on the Green Bay side.
I'm going to take the opposite point of view here than you. I'm going to look at the Minnesota side in this one. And for Green Bay, I mean, look, they've played 1 good defense this year, 2 good defenses this year, 1 in Seattle, 1 in Cincinnati. Cincinnati was, in a pretty tough spot. You're coming off that Falcons game. And that was one where Green Bay, didn't do anything really in the first half. I mean, it was the Bengals having problems in the second half that allowed Green Bay to come back and take down that victory. So they played a pretty good Cincinnati defense that had a lot of first half success against them. Mike McCarthy made some adjustments. Kudos to him for that. They wind up eking out a win there in that one. Last 2 weeks, I like the Bears defense. I think they've got some talent, but they're still trying to figure out this whole thing under Vic Fangio. The Cowboys defense is a mess without Sean Lee. They just completely miss that guy. They get a good Minnesota defense here in this one. And this Minnesota offense, it does what it does. It's missing Dalvin Cook, which is certainly a problem, but they've got guys they can get the ball to in space, and I don't love this Green Bay defense. They've had some injury issues at all levels of this defense. Mike Daniels has been in and out. They've had some problems in the secondary with some of their defensive backs being out. So, I don't know. I feel like Minnesota's in a fairly decent spot here. I know they're coming off the Monday night game, but, I think this is a game where they could, really certainly win this game, obviously. I don't even know if you need 3 points here. I think this is one where, you probably get a situation where Minnesota either wins the game or Green Bay is just clearly the better team and covers the numbers. So I think a Minnesota money line play is certainly a worthwhile look.
Well, perhaps what I'm hearing you say is that the beer and burger that I owe you are now up for grabs in a double or nothing situation in this game.
I'm good with that. If you're good with that, I'm good with that. We can.
We'll do that.
All right, we'll handshake over the air on that one, I guess. But I mean, hey, we'll see who's got bragging rights here in this one. I also love the divisional home dog angle. I mean, it's hard not to in a lot of these particular situations. But we'll move on from that game here, and we'll stay with one NFC North team. That's the Chicago Bears. They head on the road to take on the Baltimore Ravens. Ravens a 6.5 to 7 point favorite here in this one. The 5 dimes number is 7. Most places out there 6.5. There are a couple of rogue 6s, including at Bookmaker, which is kind of interesting. What are your thoughts on this one?
I'm looking at, number one, first off, what Chicago has done on the road. And, granted, they're going to have a new quarterback, but they have not been a good road team. Now, the funny thing is, 2 weeks ago, who would want to be on Baltimore at all? After losing to Jacksonville and Pittsburgh back-to-back weeks, they looked as bad as anyone. Their offense wasn't moving the ball. All of a sudden, a feel-good win against Oakland with a backup quarterback, and the line's probably a few points higher than it should be. But I am a total advocate of playing against a rookie quarterback in his first road start. Baltimore's defense is still solid, and to make it worse, you're having a rookie quarterback make his first road start on a short week after a division Monday night game. There's only one way for me to play in this, and that's with Baltimore, with an offense that found itself against the Oakland D. And, they have Minnesota on deck, so they don't have a big division game. They don't have a short week on deck. It sits up well. Baltimore's off a previous home loss when they were embarrassed themselves against Pittsburgh. Now they're returning to their fans. To me, I don't like laying 7 with Baltimore with an offense that is in the lower half of the league. But I expect their defense to at least get a couple picks. We saw Trubisky, late in the game. He threw one across the middle that was dropped. Then he threw that late pick. When you start getting pressure on him and you're playing with a little angst, like we saw him late trying to come back, I think that's what you're going to have most of the time in front of the Baltimore faithful.
Yeah, I think what's really hard about the handicap for this game is that, like you, I think that this number is a little bit too high. I think this number is inflated based on what Baltimore has done, and then also, of course, the perception of Baltimore against Trubisky. The problem is, even though there probably is a little bit of line value, even though the true number for this game is probably more like 5, 5.5, something like that, can you really trust Mitch Trubisky against a Baltimore defense that's as good as it is? We saw him really struggle with Minnesota. Minnesota and Baltimore have pretty even defenses, I would say. I think Minnesota's maybe a tiny bit better, but still, I mean, you run into a situation here where he's facing another really good defense for the second straight week. Joe Flacco finally looked a little bit better last week. That may be more of a statement on Oakland than it is about Joe Flacco and his arm. But still, it's something you have to consider. It's something you have to factor into this game. I presume that the best bet in this game would probably wind up being the under, because I do like the Chicago defense. I do like what they have going with Fangio. I think it's just taking a little bit of time. But it's a big number to lay. I do think, though, that this is a game where we probably see a pretty significant percentage of teasers using Baltimore, bringing them down to pick 'em.
I completely agree. And, the other thing to remember when, being a young quarterback on the road, it changes the way you have to prepare. I mean, I don't know if Trubisky has the ability to audible calls or not. Usually you have 1 or 2 safe audibles. And, if this were the Kansas City or Seattle, one of those louder venues, I would be all lined up to play against them. I mean, Baltimore's got a decent crowd where they get into the game, but, Trubisky on the road with the not being able to call plays, not being able to hear yourself, missed snaps, missed cadences is the issue. But I agree with you. I think Vegas is certainly going to this is a game where I think Vegas would absolutely love a Chicago Bears straight-up win to block all those teasers. Usually they root against New England and Pittsburgh. Those are the two favorite teams for people to tease against because they're at home, because when they're at home, they're laying over a touchdown, and you could tease them down to a single score. But I think you're right on the ball this week that Baltimore may lead the Vegas bets with teasers this week.
Last thing I will ask you about this game here is that, Baltimore starts the year with a couple of division games, one at Cincinnati, and then they host Cleveland, go across the pond to London to play Jacksonville, come back and play a division game against Pittsburgh, get blown out in that one, make the long trip out to the West Coast to play Oakland. This has not been a good travel schedule or situational schedule for Baltimore to this point through 5 weeks here. They don't have their bye until week 10, which is November 12th. Any concerns about that? Any concerns about, how this team may fare from a situational standpoint? Maybe not necessarily in this game, but going forward, where they're at Minnesota next week, a tough place to play. Thursday night game against a hapless Miami team. Do you feel like you're going to be watching for some of those things with Baltimore here before their bye week?
Well, we'll see. I mean, that's the interesting point. Up until this year, only one team didn't want their bye after coming back from London. So this was a situation where Baltimore just didn't want to bye week 4. Now, they probably could have used it the way they looked to playing the Pittsburgh, but, winning changes a lot. Oakland, Pittsburgh, obviously a very physical game. They came out of it with Oakland. But, again, it's a late trip back to Oakland. You're getting ready for the Bears. Now, maybe you know better than I. I have not gotten into all the NFL injuries, but Monday night they talked about Gruden talked very much in the fourth quarter how the Bears were without their top 4 play caller linebackers. Now I don't know if those guys are just banged up and out or if they're out for multiple games. I'll look at that further going into Sunday, but that would concern me, especially on the road again when you have your offensive signal caller out and you have your top 1 or 2 defensive signal callers out, both on the road.
One other thing I want to make mention of here, and I presume this is something that we'll talk about on our Super Contest segment on tomorrow's show, is that pretty much all the teams coming off of bye weeks got steamed here this week, and that's Washington, Atlanta, New Orleans, and I believe Denver is the other one that's coming off the bye. So, that's something that is interesting and worth watching here as well, is that, you've got these teams that have this extra week of prep time, and the market is just looking to hammer them. So, New Orleans, the first team to take a bye coming off that London game, so that should be interesting to see with their game against the Lions. But do you feel like the books will adjust here heading into week 7 and maybe give, those teams coming off of a bye, and there are some decent ones here this week. I mean, when you look at the teams coming off of the bye here, Dallas is one of them. Cincinnati is a team that started to look a little bit better before their bye. Buffalo, great defensive team. Then Seattle being the other one. Do you feel like those numbers are going to be inflated a little bit here as we head into week 7 based on the early week action we saw this week?
I don't think one instance is going to change it. I think that would need to occur for a couple weeks to get the numbers. There's going to be a few people on it and say, well, look what happened. But I am not going to overreact to 1 week with couple teams and say that's a situation. You're probably familiar with Mark Lawrence in the playbook. I'm going to give you guys one stat for them. NFL teams now returning from London are 10-2-1 against the spread. That's with the Baltimore loss this year. And they're 8-0-1 ATS with rest. When you're coming back from London and you have rest, those teams are now 8-0-1 against the spread in their next game if they took that bye week after London.
Well, that would certainly apply to New Orleans this week, so we'll see what the Saints are able to do here as a 4.5, 5-point favorite against Detroit. But Rolf Michaels from WagerTalk.com, what's going on over at the website right now, man?
Just getting ready. We have, of course, the Gridiron Guide, and those that follow baseball had the first pitch up there, working on an NBA newsletter. NBA tips off next Tuesday. It'll be up starting next week, but keep your eyes open and go to WagerTalk.com, college football. Check out the Gridiron Guide as the season progresses, week in and week out. You're getting more and more data in there. easy. You know, Adam and I talked numerous times about teams getting outgained. You know, you look down at a glance, you can see the plus or minus yards per game. You can see the turnovers per game. Helps you quite a bit when you're looking at these matchups, finding value.
Well, you can follow Rolf on Twitter at CalSportsLV. Rolf Michaels, thank you so much for your time again, man. We appreciate it. I'll talk to you again next week.
Thanks, Adam.